Hi guys, Alian Alver here. We are back with LeadHer Shift. And as usual, we are speaking to dynamic women from around the globe. And we're touching base with actually one of, I'll let her introduce herself actually. And I really want to touch today on leadership in the workplace, in the global space, in the corporate space, but also what does future proofing leadership look like? And I'm going to jump right into our next guest. I'm going to let her introduce herself and then we'll go straight into the show. Hello.
Hi, Alian. My name is Alecia Maragh. My passion is really around innovation. And to that end, we started a podcast called The Next Normal Podcast, geared at helping um, the average person to get a sense of what's coming in the world by interviewing senior and executive leadership at the top of their sectors. Yeah.
Nice. So I saw that you are or were a TEDx speaker. Now, talk me through what that looks like. Talk me through how does one even become a TEDx speaker? Is almost like this exclusive community in a sense. Talk to me about that experience and what that was like for you.
Sure. So I did my TEDx speech while I was at the London School of Economics, and what happens is that every year they have this big LSC TEDx conversation, this conference, and they choose one student leader to present at the conference, and then they of course curate brilliant minds from across the UK and from across the world. And to get to be that student leader, they did this student competition where everybody kind of gave their TEDx talk, and then it was voted on, and then they went through this process. But I will say that um, it was a bit daunting. Like you, I was like, this is a very exclusive thing. Am I a good person? Do I have anything to say? Is my messaging even worth listening to? And so I crafted a message really around human rights, because that was my field of study, around how the human rights experiment and project is, despite the fact that we see it as entrenched in all our democratic institutions and in our political culture, it's a fairly new project in the way that we understand it, and so it's still fragile, and it requires each of us waking up to dream it up and to get it to be what we need it to be, so it works for everyone.
I'm always so intrigued by the kind of topics that come out of TEDx, the lens through which speakers speak to the issues and the creativity that comes from it. What was preparing for something like that looks like? Like, what does that look like?
So for me, I had done Toastmasters, which is a great like leadership development tool or methodology. I definitely recommend that everyone does something to craft how they present themselves in front of people. So for me, I had the opportunity to jump on. It was in Zoom at that time. It was Skype calls.
Yeah.
And just get all my Toastmaster friends and DTMs to kind of present in front of them and ask them what they thought. And like for me, it's about the impact, like what impact whenever you're doing a messaging is what's the impact that you want to leave, what do you want that person in the audience to think and to know and to do. And in crafting any public communication, if you use that as your guiding post, then you're more likely to be successful. And so in terms of preparation, it's really about ensuring that the audience would have left with something that they could go off to do, and really ensuring that there was nothing in my mannerism or in how I presented that was anything less than powerful. And to do that, I pulled in people that were proficient and competent and brilliant at doing just that.
I remember meeting you so many years ago, and I don't even want to
No,
say
don't
how
say
long.
that. Don't say that. It wasn't that long. I'm not.
I'm
It
not
couldn't
even
have
gonna
been.
say how long ago because that's gonna show up a lot of things. But I remember meeting you in the UN space and us having different conversations, and you even sharing that you lived in Japan. And it was so mind-boggling to me because you were speaking a different language and all these different things was happening. I was like, this is so amazing to see this young individual doing all these amazing things and having these kind of experiences. How do you feel like you've led yourself through it all? Like, going through all these experiences that you've had, having a myriad of, I think you are dynamic and having a great career.
Thank you.
What is it that drove you or led you through this? Like, how did you lead yourself?
Um, so that's a great question. I can't take full credit for leading myself. I had an amazing community, but more importantly, I have a family and my mother in particular. So in the way of background, I grew up in Jamaica. I grew up in Spanish Town, which isn't it's not certainly not Negril or Montego Bay, or it's this community that's unfortunately been associated with a lot of violence.
Mm,
And I even remember, like, in 1998, we had the gas riots, with the oil riots. And the type of community that I lived in was one where there was things burning in the streets. There was actually a car that was set on fire. And so
wow.
that's a kind of community
Yeah.
where violence was not uncommon. And so for the only way I could have made it out of that community and kind of had not fallen prey to some of the influences around, was the fact that I had a really, really strong mother who would take the time out to read extra work and give me extra homework and make sure that I was first in the class. Because when you're in a class of 50 persons, you either have to be really bright or you have to be really bad to get attention. And so
Mm,
she just made sure that I didn't go the route of being very bad, and making sure that I was always like studying and trying really hard. So having that as an important influence in your life in the formative years meant that no matter what you did, you always had that. Like, if it's about always beating the odds. And so if it was going to Japan, on the JET program, where 15 persons in Jamaica are selected each year out of how many, like 100 and odd that apply, it was, my mom believes in me, I can do this, and then using that to propel me through. Yeah.
would you say your mom was like the first leader you were influenced by, or is there another stage in your life that you feel that leadership, was evident to you?
I think definitely my mom was definitely among the first leadership that I saw. Not just the not that the so I think it's interesting. It's just recently that I started to understand leadership in a much
Mm,
more dynamic way than I used to. So when I was younger, we understood leadership to be, very strong, very firm, very hard.
right.
Almost always masculine and male. Um,
Mm,
and I think now we're starting to understand the benefits of, like, servant leadership, and leading, to empower your team, and like this kind of principled, more like nurturing type of leadership, so that your team becomes leaders themselves. So with that newfound understanding of leadership, I would say my mom was definitely the first, that I saw. And then I've been fortunate to have strong leaders in my life, or to be able to look to, even if it's on TV, to the right influences. Because if you have the right lens on, you can find strong leadership anywhere. Like, it's really about what how do you see the world? Do you see the world as everything is going wrong, or do you look for those sparks of brilliance and leadership and joy, and all the things that are positive?
in the many experiences you had, whether in the corporate space or in whatever space that you've had a career, what would you say is the one thing you admired about the leaders you worked with?
Um, so I think it's a little bit of what we just started to speak about. It's about, um, understand. It's one, giving your team stretch goals so that they're stretched to their potential.
Right.
Um, it's two, about, like, very strong accountability expected, and results oriented, like ensuring that there is no excuse for not getting to where you need to get. And then it's the last piece around that servant leadership piece, where your aim is to bring out the best in your team, and to get them to be as true to who they are and be as authentic in the space as possible, and become leaders in and of themselves. So your aim isn't to kind of have this very strong, centralized, where you tell everybody what to do and it trickles down. It's really about how do you empower those around you so that you can trust them to make the decisions and so that they can continue to progress in their life and in their careers.
Mm. I heard you say trust them to make the decisions. And I think a lot of leaders don't necessarily let go of that level of control to allow for trust to
Mm-hmm.
exist. And then to add to that, you also said, that we kind of grew up with this understanding of leadership being more of a masculine kind of role or thing.
Mm-hmm.
So with that said, like how has your experience been seeing women in the workplace? And is there a difference, do you think, from what you've seen in the types of leadership from woman to man?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. And
Mm.
it's tough on for a number of reasons. Is that yes, we like to think of um, women being more nurturing and men being more domineering
Yeah.
or dominating. But I think one of the things that has come with the kind of um, the the expansion of feminism and the expansion of like options is that you don't have to stick to these very narrow constructs of what like a female leadership looks like or what a male leadership looks like. And so increasingly I've seen more fluidity and you've seen female leaders that are a little more dominating in their nature and male leaders that are a lot more nurturing. And so I'm happy to see that even though there's a lot to research to indicate that like some of the more traditional constructs that we believe in still exist, there's definitely more fluidity. I think it is dependent on personality. I think it is dependent on culture. I've had the opportunity
Mm.
to live and work in different cultures and you do see the differences there as well. I think we need to get to the point where we are teaching everyone um, the kind of leadership skills where it's not just about command and control. Yes, it's important to be able to be decisive in certain situations. Yes, it's important to be able to set some hard lines in the sand and say, okay, these are the parameters we cannot pass it, especially when we live in a world that's constantly evolving and changing and being able to adapt. But I think we also just need to understand leadership more holistically, and maybe that's part of like MBA programs, and maybe that's part of how we teach in schools. But I think I want us to get to a part where it's not associated with either male or female in terms of like strong, powerful, empathetic, principled, authentic leadership.
Yeah, for sure. And you made such a powerful point there where you said, sometimes the shift in leadership comes from culture, but most importantly, it's in a lot of ways based on personality and how you are as a character. Like what your character is can easily swiftly determine how you lead or what kind of leader you are. Um, so tracking back a little bit, tell me two fun facts about you. The listeners want to know of all these things we're learning so far. What are two fun facts, or at least one fun fact that the listeners would be intrigued to hear about?
Thanks for putting me on the spot there. Um, so I once built a toilet in the snow.
Oh,
So that was one. And then the second one is I was part of a trip called the Peace Boat where we went around the world, and I had the opportunity to go to Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. Um,
oh,
and that was amazing. That felt like home. It had all the elements that I would want if I was able
okay, so that is interesting. And from those two fun facts,
to.
what is one way in which you led yourself or a team?
Um, so I think from the first fun fact, because once you learn how to build a toilet in the snow, you are amazing. You can lead
I think
anything.
you are for real.
No, I'm joking, but I think so. So building a toilet in the snow was a part of an expedition called the Commonwealth Women's Antarctic Expedition. And basically what it was this lady woke up one day and was like, wouldn't it be cool to take, 8 women or 16 women from these tropical countries, some of whom had never seen snow, and have them ski across Antarctica? And so she was like, how do I make this happen? And so she pulled 16 women, 2 from each of these 8 countries. Jamaica was selected, brought us to Norway on an Antarctic expedition. And for me, a lot of the leadership that we talk about is always very conceptual. Like it's in a book. This made it very real because we were skiing for several days, almost a week, across sorry about that, across a plain where it got really windy, got really snowy. We had to make sure that we put on our protective tent. We had to make sure that when it was your time to have the GPS, that you weren't leading your team astray, because if you led them astray, it meant that they had to cover that ground back the next day.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so it's your responsibility to make sure that
Mm.
that um, you're not giving others extra work, that you're doing the right thing, that you're leading them right. And for me, that happened when um, I had this experience when I was 20, and I think that was very formative for me, because it took something that you'd probably learn from a class where people tell you something very abstractly and put it in real life. Like, what are the consequences of your action? How do you ensure you have results? How do you ensure you don't let your team down? How do you win against the other team? Like, these are all things that were like very actionable and real with consequences. So yeah.
So do you think from even that experience and all the others that you've had since then, that it's necessary to have practical components of leadership? Because I know oftentimes when we think of helping persons to understand leadership, we often think of workshops, courses, different certifications. Do you think it's important, even from a young stage? Because I think leadership is going to shift over time, especially if generationally we don't start with youth. So do you think it's necessary to have that practical component, and why?
I do, and I think part of it is understanding that there are different learning styles, right? So when you, I know when I was covering my change management course, one of the things is that if you understand that people learn differently and can
Right.
grasp concepts differently, so some people are more pragmatic and they need to have this in action for them to actually for it to stick with them. Others can kind of abstractly think about it. Others can reflect on it. So I think we have to, one, cater to the different learning styles. Two, um, I think a big part of leadership is around, if we're talking, it's like, is where you are, if you're at a summer camp, or if you're at a you are in your student council. Like, these are all different places in real situations where you're having that interaction with human beings, where you're facing against real conflict. It's one thing to say, if I were in that situation, this is what I would do. It's another thing when you're actually in the helm of leadership, or in that position, and you have to then um, you know make sure that you are communicating well, or that you're not getting angry, or you're
Yeah.
managing the emotional regulation, that you're seeing the bigger picture, that you're being strategic. So yes, I do think it's really important. And even in workshops, you can make sure that you have these group simulations, or these group
Yeah.
team assignments, preferably outside, where so then you get to replicate it in a real way.
Do you think, because I there's so much that's coming out of this conversation, honestly, but there's a bigger part, I think, in terms of the emotional side of leadership. Because oftentimes, persons have different personalities, we grow up in different cultures, we have different experiences, we learn differently in many ways, but we don't tap in necessarily to understanding the intelligence of our emotion and how that plays a big role in how we influence others. How important do you think that is? And or more so, what is it about emotional intelligence that is necessary for leadership?
um, I think um, I think it's just like, if you're dealing with people, then it's if which is a big part of any leadership. it's going to be important for you to be emotionally intelligent. I think um, if we look to what the future might look like, reading a lot of the WEF reports, reading a lot of the thought leadership pieces that are coming out of the Big Four, we're seeing more and more it's going to be those soft skills
Right.
that are going to be particularly valuable,
Right.
because some of the other pieces can be automated by machines.
Right.
And so it's really going to be, how do you bring out the best in people? How do you ensure that you can see when someone is a little bit down on their luck, or you can have those relationships, because we bring our full selves to work. We bring our full selves to any environment. I guess the best case in point would be, we've seen a lot of the protests that came out of
Yeah.
George Floyd's murder. And so if you as a leader didn't have the emotional intelligence to realize that there is a community that is hurting, that is feeling victimized, and who cannot bring they cannot come to work as the full professional that you need them to be and do the results, because they're hurting from the injustices that they're seeing meted out to persons like them, then you're not going to get the results, and you're not going
Yeah.
to come across as a very empathetic leader. So to
Yeah.
your question of how important is EI, I think it's critical. I think you can't have one without the other.
And I think you made a very valid point, because that emotional component, if not considered as part of leadership, you are not going to get on the other end, which is what most leaders want, is productivity and production.
Yeah,
And if you don't tap into that with your team, you're more likely not going to be productive. It's going to affect your bottom line anyway, because your team isn't feeling safe. Your team isn't feeling, like there's empathy in the room. Your team isn't feeling like they're human. Just,
yeah.
just plain old human,
Yeah,
right?
and that their humanity is recognized and respected by the members on their team. I completely agree, and I think part of it as well is, you mentioned earlier in kind of the generation divide, and you mentioned like how leadership will shift with the generations, and I think we're seeing with millennials and we're seeing with Gen Zs that the workplace that they expect to go to is one that's a lot more caring. It's one that has more sense of their of ESG, that recognizes that it has a role to play in society, that recognizes it has a role to play with its employees. And so, if you're thinking about future proofing your organization just from a standpoint of being relevant for the next generation,
Mm.
if you don't have those components, then you're going to go the way of the dodo. And so, again, EI really showing a direct link to what your bottom line is and what your feasibility as a business would look like.
I think there are some companies who don't recognize that at the end of the day, your team are human and people. And oftentimes people buy from people. So if your team isn't good, they're not going to present what is necessary for customers to feel like, okay, well, So going back to your career and your the different layers to you, I see that you are an agile project management consultant, innovation consultant. What does that mean? Like, in the grand scheme of things, what does that mean?
Sure. So most of my career has been in the not-for-profit space and in technology, and more recently in the technology space as I've moved to Canada. And so it's project management that we generally associate with project management. You have a task to complete. You ensure that you do it within the scope, the budget, the timelines. But then we're also recognizing that very often we live in a world that's rapidly changing. We don't
Yeah.
want to invest too much money in um, upfront or resources upfront. And so it's then important, not just in project management or product management, but in everything we do. It's really important for us to have an agile framework, to have an agile approach. And we're seeing that across every sector now. So when you think about the fact that people are working from home, um, one of the ways that leaders have tried to ensure that their team stays on track is by having daily scrums. So every day for 15 minutes, you meet on Zoom or on Skype or any
Right.
other video conferencing tool. and you answer these three questions, which can, like, it doesn't have to be these three, but the questions around what did you do yesterday, what are you looking to do today, and what are the impediments that are standing in your way of getting you to where you need to go. And so we're seeing that agility in terms of how people work, which is coming from agile project management replicated across different verticals. But to your question about in the grand scheme of things, why does it matter? Because the world is changing very quickly. We live in a VUCA world. We live in a world that's highly volatile and complex. And so because of that, it then is important for you to get to results, fail fast, see what's working, see what's not working, throw it out the window, and then iterate on it and continue towards what might work. And so that's why I think it's important, and I think it continues on that theme of we are going to live in a very different world post-COVID than when we entered it. It might just be 4 months, but that 4 months so far is going to be revolutionary. And so it's really about, more than anything, the mindset that you have as you embrace the future. And it has to be one where you are willing to upskill and reskill and future-proof your knowledge base and be agile and recognize that what happened yesterday might not be tomorrow. And so really just start with that mindset. And so that's what I think is why it's important in today's world.
How important is it for just employees, entrepreneurs, just professionals in general to shift their mindset towards this change? Because I know many persons are struggling with remote work. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
You know, some have been doing remote work for eons. Some have never done remote work at all. And somehow there needs to be a shift in how we think about work and work not being in four walls, right? So, what's your thoughts on how important it is for that mindset shift to happen, and how can persons even shift their mindset? Like, what advice would you give in that regard?
I think that's a brilliant question. I think it starts with telling yourself that you are. It starts with the kind of messaging that you tell yourself on a daily basis, no matter what. Like, we've recognized that COVID has left a lot. It's not just about remote work. It's about, like, people's entire lives have been upended. We have to realize that millions of people are now unemployed because they've been laid off due to COVID. Millions of people are worried about, what the economic situation would look like in a few months, whether we're going to have a recession or a deflation or a downturn or what that might look like, right? People have lost loved ones. Like, this has had real consequences where people have lost people that they love and that are family members, and that they're going through, they're processing this very real trauma. And then there are people who have to now shift from going in and seeing their colleagues, and then if there's an issue, talking it through, to now doing that remotely. On top of, if you have a child, and so you're doing childcare for them. If you have an elderly person you have to take care of, if you have a family member that you have responsibilities around, like home, like making sure the place is tidy. So now you're juggling several balls that you didn't have to do within a 9-to-5 space. So I think recognizing the challenges and allowing people to process that, because if you think about the stages of grief or anything that's happened, like, you have to go through the same thing happens with change, that you have to go through the different cycles of faith, denial, and going through, right? I think once we've recognized for what it is and realized the loss that's associated with, like, the old normal, then it's about the messaging that you tell yourself. So it's waking up in the morning and going, one, I'm a curious human being. I'm a curious human being. I can do this. My best days are ahead of me. I've gotten through countless situations in the past. I'll get through the next one. Or instead of seeing change as, yes, it is scary. It is scary. It's challenging. It's uncertain. It's a lot of things that would make you want to cower in your room and cry. But it's also exciting. It's also an opportunity to reinvent yourself. It's also an opportunity for you to be to be relevant in the future. And I think for me, how I've framed it is what COVID has done is kind of accelerated things that were going to happen anyways. We knew we were going to shift towards remote work. Experts were expecting that several years down the line, but we knew that was coming. We knew that we were going to, like, we were getting towards a more digitalized society, and we knew all of these things were coming. Now it's here.
Right.
So you can use this opportunity to really think about, how do I ensure that I start getting the skill set that I will need for tomorrow and keep upskilling, so that whatever situation I'm in today, I'm never in again. How do I make sure that if I've been unemployed, that I do what's necessary in terms of upskilling, so that I'm never in a situation where I'm competing with people for limited amount of jobs. So instead, there's so many jobs in certain sectors where they don't have enough persons to fill. Cybersecurity is one of the spaces where they're looking for experts. Data analysis, especially like further along the data science chain, they are always looking for experts to fill that, and generally they don't have it. So how do you look at, in addition to mirroring your passions and what you're good at, and that with what will be needed for tomorrow, and making sure that you find that sweet spot, so that you're in that frame of mind where I'm ready for the future. I'm
Yeah.
always ready for the future.
Yeah. And it's so important because I think for those who I think what COVID taught us honestly is that you can't feel like you're secure ever. Like, and I think oftentimes different professionals in different careers or employees in different companies felt comfortable, like, this is my job, this is my title, this is what I've been doing, I've been certified and I have these titles, so I'm good, I'm always going to have
Yeah,
this job. And you've kind of prepared in your mind, or have set the mindset that I'm going to retire out of this job. And I think what we've seen both for the younger generation and also for the older generation is that nobody's secure, right? Your job is not something to just glorify as to do upon until retirement.
mm-hmm.
So for those who are maybe a little more mature and, feeling like they have just either lost their job or been forced into entrepreneurship, what would you say to them? Like, what would be your message in that regard, especially when the the idea is that you should be reskilling, retooling, getting yourself prepared for
Yeah,
the future of work, so to speak.
yeah. No, it's a tough, challenging message, and I don't even think I'm the one to
Yeah.
send a message out there. But I can say that my mother, for example, is someone who isn't very tech savvy. She's not someone who loves change. Like, she's an amazing leader. She's you know groomed the people around her, and she's very good at, like, relationships and that sort of thing. But she doesn't like anything related to computers, or she doesn't want to do the upskilling and the reskilling. And so I'm that annoying daughter on the end of the line every single day, going, this is the task I have for you today. Can you do this? And then I'll come
Right.
back and make your work. Um, so I know what it's like to, I can empathize with her, and I can understand, like, it's scary and it's hard
Yeah,
and
it
it's
is.
difficult. You're competing against people that would have grown up with a cell phone literally attached to their hand the moment they were
Yeah.
born.
Yeah.
Um, but I think just think baby steps. First of all, don't buy into the narrative that you can't teach a dog old tricks.
Ah,
Um, really start with this idea that you have to put on a growth mindset, and that your brain is this brilliant, beautiful tool that you know can be can you can sever some of the links and find new links, and, like, you can really rewire your brain with the right, like, mindset. And I think starting there and take those baby steps. Like, don't worry that, oh my gosh, I've been laid off, I need to become a programmer by Friday. Like, that's not
yeah.
realistic. But
Yeah.
think about one thing that you can do every single day, And that will propel you into doing another thing. And that will, once you've been successful at one thing, then you'll find yourself, your brain will be like a muscle, that like a very strong guy who's been working out a lot, where it's going to be like, yeah, I want to learn something else. I want to try something new. But I think that would be my message, but I don't necessarily think it's my place to be telling anyone who's in that situation what to do.
So how has COVID directly impacted you, and what have you been doing so far since this whole, what seems like a transition for everyone, you know?
So I'm going to, so one of the reasons why I can say some of the things I've said is because, and say like very authentically, is because I've been drinking my own medicine. So I joined the millions of persons in Canada and in the US and across the world that have, that are now unemployed because of COVID. And coming out of that, I've taken the time to, of course, do some of those certifications that we talked about, really thinking about what are some of the skills. So like I started doing very basic programming. There are a couple websites out there, some of which are free, some of which are, you can pay a nominal price, some are exorbitant. Some of the ones that I've been playing around with is She Codes and Code Academy. And so you can look at what are some of the freer, cheaper, more inexpensive resources. And then on top of that, I started the podcast that we spoke about. And I know you and I were talking before the show, but for me, it came from a place of, if you had asked that young girl in Spanish Town when I was 9 years old, what do I want to be when I grow up? I would have had maybe 1-2 answers for you. I'd have been like a lawyer. And that's all I could have seen. Like that's the only, if I looked on TV, that's what, working hard and being driven and represented. I didn't know that there was a whole world of like being a programmer or being a design thinker or being these kind of like titles and experiences didn't exist for me. There was always this information gap. And so part of this podcast that we've launched is one, to speak to the leaders in their field and get a sense of what the moving target is so that we can kind of use that as a reference to move towards. But the aim is, as we go along, to do the kind of programming that can help someone, that a 9-year-old girl in Spanish Town or in another community, to understand that yes, she might want to be a lawyer, but increasingly lawyers are becoming blockchain lawyers, or lawyers are having some of the more administrative pieces of their work done by AI. And so that by the time she gets and does all the right things, not having that information gap, be the reason why she isn't top of her field or she isn't cutting it. So that's one of the things that I've been up to outside of just upskilling, and then using the time to have conversations. Like people are at home now, they have a little bit more time in their schedule because you're not traveling, and so using that time to have these coffee chats, because that's how, in my mind, I think I'm going to find my next opportunity.
And it's so interesting because so your new podcast is called the Next Normal Podcast. And what I took from that is, was the next normal? Was the next normal in work? Was the next normal in business? Was the next step of where persons need to go or be, or who they need to be, but also who they need to be for others? So my question to you is, how do we do that? How do we future proof, you know, what professional work life looks like? How do we future proof leadership? How do we ensure that for the future that will be coming with more technology and more innovation and all the different shifts that will happen, that leadership is still evolving as we move forward?
You've asked so many great questions. I'm going to say a couple of things. One is, I don't think anyone knows what the future will bring. Like, if somebody knew what the future would bring, I would be their best friend.
I would too, by the way.
But I don't think anyone knows what's going to happen. I think what we can do is curate the insights from some very well-placed, well-positioned persons who have a little bit more advantage. a little bit more of a view into the future, into the like, and see the larger forest while we're sometimes very stuck on the trees.
Yeah.
That's the first bit. And then the second bit is, in some ways, as much as things change, some things will remain the same. Like
Same.
we still are these complex human beings that need to have our social and emotional and spiritual and physical and all of these other needs met. And how we might do it might change with time. But we still will be like, there will still be this interesting overlay and intricate um, relationship with all these parts. And so I think emotional intelligence will continue to be important. I think World Economic Forum had put together what are some of the top skills that will be needed. And a lot of those top skills aren't the technical skill sets, they're the creativity and the complex problem solving and the more around relationships. So these are all the pieces that they have consistently, and if you look at their skills over the years, generally these skills have, they fluctuated a bit, but you can still see a trend in these skills. So I think finding ways to nurture those skill sets, and it doesn't have to be it doesn't necessarily have to be at a job. So it could be at home, like if you have an extra time, do some painting, because then you're spurring that creative juice in your brain, so you can be creative in other ways, because that's a skill set that's needed for the future, right? So thinking about how can you get to build those skills, even if it's not in a 9 to 5 situation, I think are the
Yeah.
things
Yeah,
I
for
say.
sure. I mean, the world is so uncertain at this moment, and I think it's really affecting many people in how they think, their mental well-being, their emotional state, how they feel about, their future and was next for them personally and even professionally. Um, what do you think is the next disruptive thing that may come? And we could dream a big dream about all the different things that may happen, but what do you think is the next disruptive thing that could happen?
Well, I wouldn't have known about COVID 4 months ago, so I am afraid to
Mm,
hazard a guess on anything. But I think we understand that data is going to be increasingly relevant. I think consumer behavior is such that we expect things. So if you think about the fact that you watch Netflix and you expect Netflix to find the right show for you to watch next, like
yeah,
that's one of your expectations. You have all of these expectations of all these companies around you, and it's because you expect a more personalized, customized experience,
yeah,
and that has
yeah,
to do with big data. So I think we're going to continue to see the growth of big data. I think we're going to continue to see AI have a more of a presence in our lives. I think we understand that blockchain is on the rise, and that could have lots of implications in terms of in a number of ways. I remember reading this article where they talked about what could the future of education look like, and
mm,
they mentioned that we could get to the point where instead of having, and again, this isn't what the future is going to hold, it's just one of the things that they discussed, where it could get to the point where instead of having one school that you go to, that you do all of your degree on, you could instead just mirroring some of the experiences where you could go to Japan for this, and it has a certain curricula like credit to it, and then all of these are experiences are pulled together for one degree. So
that would
there's
be
a lot of
dope, by the
these.
way.
It would be,
That would be so dope.
but so there are lots of people who are speculating what the future look like. We don't quite know, but I think the most important thing um, really is just being ready for it. Like whatever comes, like having the resilience and the emotional fortitude to say whatever happens, I've got this. Like we've as a human, like as humanity, we've been through some really really difficult things in the past. We've been through world wars. We've been through countless you know things around the world that like would cripple, that you would expect to just cripple, but we have as a community incredible resilience, and we'll get through it.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that the pandemic has definitely taught us is that we require that level of connectivity.
We do.
And that level of connectivity has shown up even more now that it's a pandemic in and of itself. There have been many epidemics, there have been many crises that have happened, but because it's now been spread globally, I think the world is now more zoomed in and fully aware of how we need each other,
Mm-hmm.
whether as regions, as countries, or even as people. Um, but generally, would you say, I know I've been hearing you say, I've been taking courses, I've been doing some research and all these different things. Why do you think it's so important to future proof yourself? Like why do you think, I mean, I know all these changes are gonna happen, but maybe they may not happen in our generation. Like why
Mm-hmm.
do you think is necessary to do that?
Um, I think there will be changes in our generation. I think the speed of change is rapidly increasing, and I think that's part of it. I think as well, I don't know if being irrelevant and obsolete or disrupted scares scares you, but and I'm sure it does, it scares me. Like it scares me to think that you would have done all the things that you would have started off where you started off. You'd have done all the hard work. You'd have gone to LSE and on a British Evening scholarship and done all of this hard work to
Yeah,
get to where you are right now, to be irrelevant and obsolete. It would blow my mind. Like,
yeah,
what was the point of all of that if you aren't if your future isn't aligned to what your potential is. And so
yeah,
that's why I think it's critical for us to future proof. It has to be all the hard work that I've done so far has to mean something. And it has to put me in a position of leadership where I can effect change for others. And so for me, that's one of the things that makes it that I can't sit and just be disruptive. That would be it would be a disservice to my mother. It would be a disservice to all the people who believe in me. It would be a disservice to potential that I've been given. And so, yeah. So whether this happens or not, and I'm sure it will, I think I have a responsibility to those around me and to myself to make sure that I'm ready for it if it happens.
I think, and even in saying that, that, well, at least from my perspective, is leadership in and of itself. Because in a lot of ways, you're not only considering your self development, you're not only considering yourself being obsolete or potentially obsolete in the workforce, but you're considering how it's going to impact those around you, from those who've supported you to those who've been there and encouraged you. And that in and of itself epitomizes leadership. But do
I
you
didn't
see
think about
yourself
it
as a
like that.
leader?
Sure.
I mean, it does. Do you see yourself as a leader, though?
Um, I do, and I think it became a lot more real for me uh, recently. So I head up I'm a vice curator and I'm part of a 3-person curatorship team for the Global Shapers Toronto Hub.
Yeah.
And I think for me that was a very important place where I learned some of the pieces that I talked about, where you leadership isn't just this very stone faced, nobody knows what's happening person, but you have to be vulnerable, you have to be honest, you have to be authentic, you have to be empathetic, like all of these words that have become quite cliche in like all the workshops that we go to. But I think I realized um, that leadership piece in a more real way when we had a protest happening, and we as an organization as well also have to decide how do we navigate this space, how do we the world has opened up in terms of having more conversations about equality and equity, not just based on race but based on all the other ways that people have been oppressed, whether that's gender or their sexual orientation or there are many ways that we continue to have these systems of power that results in oppression for some and privilege for others. Um, and as we were navigating through this space, I could tell that there were persons who wanted to have this conversation, who wanted to have a really deep, meaningful conversation about how do I, how do we dissect privilege and how do we use our privilege for to further racial equality and all the other inequalities. And we also understood that there were persons who needed to be supported along this process, and there were persons who, of course, felt who, of course, were hurting from seeing all of this. And so it was in that moment where you recognize that it was your responsibility to create that safe space for you to, like, quite honestly address the issue up up and center, like in front of you. You can't brush it under the rug, and to have that space for that real conversation to happen so that you can get to action. So what do I do so that we can reflect on this, so we can interrogate this, so that we can move forward, so that we can then use our platform for meaningful change. And I think it's in that moment, using my platform for leadership, that I realized that this had become less textbook and, yes, you've gotten an award for leadership in the past, but in a real meaningful way, that you've led people through. Yeah.
I think of all the things that, even based on this conversation, of all the things that I think I'm reminding myself of, and I hope the listeners um, understand this point, is that regardless of what position you're in, regardless of what level of experience you had, regardless of how much you've learned until this point, you always have to keep learning. And
Mary, right?
yeah,
Why?
it never stops. It should never stop. Um, but I think COVID is a even more of a reminder of that, of
Mm-hmm.
how the future is gonna change, how life is gonna change rather in the future. Um, and how much you know is going to depend on whether you're a part of that future significantly or not.
Mm-hmm.
Um, was your advice now, as we start to think about the young girl who's coming up, or we start to think about the person who's been in their career for years and shifting to entrepreneurship, or even someone who is now trying to move up the value chain in their leadership, what would be that one bit of advice at least that you can leave with them um, for their next step? So not general advice, but something very tangible they can do from today.
Um, so that's a great question, and I'm not going to give advice from my own mouth. I've been fortunate, and maybe this is the advice. I've been fortunate um, to have elders in my community, two elders um, who helped me to set things in the longer arc of time and longer arc of history. So instead of going, oh my God, I'm at home, like my life is over, like um, you'll never find a job in this economy, boo boo. Then they have 140 years between the both of them combined experience, and so with that they can go, this situation happened in this year and this situation happened this year, this situation, like, things will work out, and they can kind of give you that zooming out, like, here's the longer arc of history. So with that in mind, that's been very helpful. So to that young girl, like, who's coming up, or that person who's changing career, or that person who is trying to get farther as they progress up the chain, I think it's really important for you to seek out the elders and the mentors and the
Mm.
sponsors, who will give you the perspective so that you don't go off course. But even as you're on the right course and you're starting to feel stuck or lost or a failure or an imposter, all the negative things can um, kind of zoom out the lens for you and kind of show you the bigger picture so that um, you don't feel disempowered. So my advice would be, seek out, go seek those persons out, and continue to surround yourself with people that you want to be like, and that you want to aspire to, because we end up becoming the average of the people we spend the most time with. So that would be my advice.
That's amazing advice, honestly, because it it sets the tone for understanding that you're never too young or too old to learn and or be mentored and or be influenced by and or influence. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that that sums up the concept of not only leading yourself but being led by others. Thank you so much. You have been
Thank you for having
absolutely
me.
amazing.
Thank you for having
Um,
me.
your insights are honestly very very vast, and I appreciate the way in which you look at things. So thank you so much for being a part of the show and being a part of the Lead Her Shift family.
Thank you.
You are welcome. So with that said, we are now signing out, and we'll be up next very soon with another Lead Her Shift episode. Until next time, guys.